You can see it swirling right over my shoulder here, what's being called a superstorm.
Superstorm.
A superstorm. It is one of the largest, if not the largest, we've ever seen in the Atlantic hurricane basis.
This morning I formally declared a state of emergency.
A state of emergency.
I'm going to sign an executive order mandating public schools be closed on Monday. The MTA has announced that they will start shutting down service.
The worst storms that has ever hit Atlantic City. This city is basically underwater.
That was a moment of absolute terror for me.
This is what Mother Nature did last night.
The president took a chopper tour with Governor Chris Christie over devastated areas of the state where Superstorm Sandy hit with full force.
I will tell you, this administration at the moment could give a damn less about Election Day.
Superstorm Sandy was one of the costliest hurricanes to hit the United States, a natural disaster in one of the most populated regions, with striking images of lower Manhattan flooded, huge swaths of the Jersey Shore destroyed, and all from a storm with the widest wind field ever recorded. Hurricane Sandy left a path of destruction across multiple states and countries. But this is not just a story about a hurricane. This is a story of what happens when disaster strikes at the peak of an election campaign and recovery becomes a political weapon. The 2012 Atlantic hurricane season was actually predicted to be a below average season. Both Colorado State and NOAA estimated on order of 10 to 15 named storms. However, about halfway through the season in August 2012, we had already been through an incredibly active Atlantic hurricane season. Key named storms such as Tropical Storm Debby, Hurricane Ernesto, and Hurricane Isaac had already made landfall in the United States. Such an already active season led NOAA to increase their estimate to 12 to 17 named storms for the 2012 hurricane season. And as you can tell from the title and thumbnail of this video, we're going to focus on the 18th and second to last storm of the 2012 hurricane season, Hurricane Sandy. Sandy started as Tropical Depression 18 on October 22, 2012, just south of Jamaica. There was a high-pressure ridge sitting just north of Jamaica that stalled Tropical Depression 18 in the Caribbean. This high-pressure ridge allowed Tropical Depression 18 to take advantage of low wind shear and warm Caribbean waters to develop quickly into a hurricane. And on October 22nd, Tropical Depression 18 would be officially named as Tropical Storm Sandy by the National Hurricane Center. And over the course of the next few days, Sandy would continue to strengthen. Sandy developing over the Western Caribbean was not unusual or unexpected for such a late season hurricane. With Sandy forming just a few days before the end of the Atlantic hurricane season, most storms in the Western Caribbean follow one of two paths. First, going west and crossing the Yucatan Peninsula or moving into the Gulf, or moving northward and being pushed out to sea by mid-latitude atmospheric patterns. However, as we all know, Sandy ultimately took a third, much less common path that only happens when atmospheric conditions are just right. If we look at the 500 millibar maps on October 24th, 2012, we can see a few key meteorological features that are going to drive Sandy's path northward. We need to look at the troughs here, and the ridge here. 5 days before landfall, this trough with an anti-clockwise motion was pulling Sandy northward, rather than being pushed into the Yucatan. On top of that, the troughs and ridges started moving eastward, while Sandy moved northward. And the position of these troughs and ridges worked as gears to drive Sandy northward. So these high and low pressure systems basically made a superhighway for this superstorm to follow up the coast. And if you want a more pure meteorological discussion about Hurricane Sandy, I highly recommend this video by Alfiria. But with all hurricanes, tornadoes, winter storms, or any big weather event, the preparation for the storm is only as good as the communication of local officials, key organizations, and also people's previous experience dealing with storms. Starting with the branding of this storm, there were already some issues. before Sandy was an officially named storm, the National Hurricane Center was already monitoring its likelihood of striking the United States. Because the National Hurricane Center is a division of NOAA and the National Weather Service, the National Hurricane Center was primarily focusing on the output of the GEFS, the Global Ensemble Forecast System, aka the weather models that are run by the National Weather Service of the United States. And as meteorologists were looking at Sandy's path 10, 9, 8, 7 days out, Hurricane Sandy was expected to be a fish storm, pushed out to sea by those mid-latitude atmospheric patterns. Up until about 7 days out, the GEFS still had a U.S. landfall as a very low probability event. However, once the model runs were starting to come in for 6 days out, 5 days out, 4 days out, the ensemble models started aligning, and a United States landfall was becoming increasingly likely. And this was concerning for the reputation of these U.S.-funded weather models. The other key player for weather forecasting is the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasting. The Euro model predicted Sandy's path with high probability 8 days in advance. Now let's just take a step back here. The National Weather Service was criticized for not knowing a hurricane's path 6 days in advance. 6 days is still an amazing lead time for an event of this magnitude. And another reason why forecasts from the National Hurricane Center do not extend past 5 days in the future. For Sandy to have been forecasted so well, so far in advance, is a testament to how far weather prediction and weather forecasting has come in the recent decades. But figuring out just where Sandy was going was not the only dilemma that the National Hurricane Center had. You see, the National Hurricane Center issues warnings and watches for tropical cyclones. They have the jurisdiction over local weather forecasting offices to issue a hurricane watch or warning. But Sandy had different plans. Hurricane Sandy was coinciding with a low pressure system moving across the United States. And just shortly before Sandy's official predicted landfall, Sandy was expected to become post-tropical. And this transition from tropical storm to post-tropical storm is incredibly important for this story. With this transition, the National Hurricane Center handed off issuing watches and warnings to local weather forecasting offices. As you can see in the sequence of the National Hurricane Center's cone, there were no tropical storm warnings issued north of North Carolina. And you can understand what this might do for public perception and understanding just the magnitude of the storm heading towards New Jersey. And regardless of whether it was tropical or post-tropical, was going to bring life-threatening winds and storm surge to a ton of states, not to mention the inland impacts of a heavy rainfall event. And this it leads to confusion, with people asking themselves, how seriously should we take this storm? Unfortunately, regardless of who was issuing the warnings, Sandy was on a quick path north. And as landfall became more imminent in the United States, states started declaring states of emergencies. Public transit was shutting down, public schools were shutting down. The East Coast was hunkering down for a storm. To understand the preparation and response ahead of Sandy, we need to take a quick tangent into the 2011 hurricane season. Notably, we need to talk about Hurricane Irene. Hurricane Irene was the 9th named storm of the 2011 Atlantic season. Now, hurricanes and tropical storms in the Northeast are not uncommon, but they're also not super common. On average, over the past century, New England and the Mid-Atlantic states have dealt with a hurricane hit about once every 12 years. And prior to the 1-2 punch of Irene in 2011 and Sandy in 2012, the most recent notable hurricane to truly hit the East Coast was Hurricane Bob in 1991. And many other storms made close calls in the area. So Sandy had something unique going for it that most other East Coast hurricanes don't have. Recency bias. A little Psych 101. Recency bias states that cognitive bias favors recent events over historical ones. So if your town was just hit by a tornado, you're more likely to take tornado warnings seriously in the near future. But therein lies a very big problem. See, with recency bias, we humans aren't evaluating how bad this upcoming storm will be. We're evaluating how bad the last one was for us. And if we look at the stats between Irene and Sandy, specifically for the state of New Jersey, Sandy should have been taken more seriously. And I want to split this information you're about to see into information you actually would have had before the storm, because that's how someone would be evaluating what's coming. Yes, the peak categories of each of these storms was the same, but we knew the size of the wind field. We knew the predicted storm surge, and we knew that this storm was coming at a full moon and a high tide. Another recipe for disaster. But if you're just looking at how Irene impacted the state of New Jersey, honestly, it was not that bad. So Sandy can't be that bad, right? The forecasts had aligned. It was time for the Northeast to prepare for Sandy. States up and down the eastern seaboard were shutting schools, shutting public transit, declaring states of emergency. Evacuations were issued for coastal communities of Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, ahead of the expected storm surge. On top of that, getting people off the roads and out of harm's way, and setting up the infrastructure to respond to the impending power outages. Prior to the storm, researchers from Johns Hopkins University estimated that Sandy was going to take out power for 10 million people on the East Coast, which is an estimated 20% of the population of the Northeast. Sandy was expected to bring 10 feet of storm surge at its peak, and more importantly, make landfall during a high tide and a full moon. And if you've watched YouTube documentaries like this, you know that is a recipe for disaster. Just 2.5 hours before landfall, Sandy's transition into a post-tropical cyclone was complete. Although not officially a hurricane, Sandy still brought the same impacts. Impacts of Sandy were felt well outside of the center of circulation. With a wind field of over 1,000 miles, the entire East Coast was affected. For over 24 hours, tropical storm force winds and waves battered the tri-state area. And due to the storm's perpendicular approach to the New Jersey coastline, storm surge became an increasingly concerning problem. With the counterclockwise spin of tropical storms, communities to the north were expected to take the worst of the storm surge. In New York City, Battery Park experienced a storm surge of over 13 feet. Across the city, flooding caused damage to the subway systems and many coastal communities. And notably, Casey Neistat calls Hurricane Sandy one of the scariest nights of his life in New York City. In New Jersey, half of Hoboken was underwater. On the Jersey Shore, a 50-foot piece of the Atlantic City boardwalk was washed away. Several barrier islands of the Jersey Shore reported over 5 feet of standing water in their communities. Superstorm Sandy decimated the coastline of New Jersey. Sandy officially made landfall in Bridgentine, New Jersey, just north of Atlantic City, at 7:30 p.m. on October 29th, 2012. Do you like my shirt? I bought it on the Garden State Parkway for this video. Anyways, back to the plot. Before we get to some of the horrific images of the Jersey Shore after Sandy and the motive for local politicians to make sure that this series of communities came back, you need to understand the cultural zeitgeist of the Jersey Shore. And no, I do not mean the 2009 hit reality TV show Jersey Shore, but also maybe I do. I don't know, you can be the judge. As with any coastal community, the shoreline is constantly in flux. Barrier islands of the Jersey Shore are situated between two large metro areas, New York City to the north and Philadelphia to the south. Since the late 1800s, the Jersey Shore has been providing respite to the city dwellers of these two major metropolitan areas, quickly becoming a resort and tourism destination. But it wasn't until the 1950s that the Jersey Shore really became what it is today. With the proliferation of the car and the development of the Garden State Parkway, tourism to the area boomed. People began moving and visiting the Jersey Shore in droves. From the casinos of Atlantic City to the doo-wop of Wildwood to the boardwalk of Seaside Heights and bougie communities with multi-million-dollar homes, there is space for everyone at the Jersey Shore. The Jersey Shore is obviously a physical place and does exist in real life, but it's also a concept. It's an encapsulation of the American dream. So if you're not from Jersey, not from the Northeast, you might not fully understand. The Jersey Shore is this weird, unique, amazing slice of Americana. And there was no way the Jersey Shore was not going to be built back. The first point here is that the Jersey Shore is no stranger to coastal storms. These barrier islands have dealt with storms for years. The Great Atlantic Hurricane of 1944, the Ash Wednesday storm of 1962, Hurricane Gloria in 1985, and as we talked about, Hurricane Irene just the year before. And financially, the Jersey Shore had to come back. For context, tourism is the third leading industry in the state of New Jersey, employing 300,000 people, or about 10% of the state's employable population. And just before Sandy was generating about $38 billion annually. So that's the context. That's the nostalgia. That's the feeling when people are seeing images like these. The cleanup following Superstorm Sandy was immense. Sandy ultimately cost $68.7 billion in damages and is currently ranked as the 7th costliest hurricane to hit the United States. In the state of New Jersey alone, Sandy caused nearly $30 billion in damage. Across 11 states, 8 countries, 254 people were killed. And not only were homes completely destroyed, but entire communities. Chances are, if you've clicked on this video and you've watched to this point, you've probably seen a number of YouTube documentaries about various tornado events. But I think something that's important to recognize in the context of this video is that this wasn't just a town, a street, one place. This was an entire state, multiple states, multiple countries. Superstorm Sandy affected an entire region. So it wasn't just one community that needed federal funding, that needed aid, needed assistance, but an entire region. And all of this to happen just 8 days before the 2012 general election. And recovery becomes a political weapon. We cannot talk about the legacy, the impacts, the recovery of Hurricane Sandy without talking about the man, the myth, the legend, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. For those of you who aren't super familiar with New Jersey politics, Chris Christie can be seen as a very polarizing figure. In 2001, he was appointed as the U.S. Attorney for the District of New Jersey by George W. Bush. In 2009, he ran and won the New Jersey governor's race, where he remained in office until 2018. Prior to becoming governor in 2009, he was most well known for his court record. He tried and convicted 132 public officials in corruption cases. This court record gained him bipartisan support and helped him ultimately clinch that 2009 victory to give him the governor's seat in the state of New Jersey. And prior to 2012, prior to Sandy, Christie was mildly popular. His favorability numbers hovered basically around 50%. And just before Sandy, about 50% of New Jerseyans were hoping to actually elect someone new in the following election cycle in 2013. Pretty moderate sentiment about the then governor of the state. But Sandy changed everything. The corruption fighter was now in charge of the recovery of one of the costliest hurricanes to hit the state. And more importantly, rebuilding an economic powerhouse of the tourism industry. All just 1 week before a national election. In the weeks after Sandy, Christie became well known for his no-nonsense politicking. And the recovery efforts also brought together 2 key polarizing figures of the time. Obviously Chris Christie, because that's literally the point of the story, but also President Obama. Now remember, Sandy made landfall on October 29, 2012, 8 days before the U.S. general election. And the duo of Christie and Obama working together became a spotlight of political bipartisanship. And it showed in polling. Both Obama and Christie received a Sandy bump following the storm. At the same time, Mitt Romney, Obama's opponent in the 2012 election, was criticized for wanting to eliminate FEMA in a statement he made in 2011. I think it's also important to note that this Sandy bump, especially for Christie, only had to do with his handling of Hurricane Sandy recovery. In other areas like education, taxes, state budget, his favorability numbers remained incredibly lukewarm at about 50%. But this Sandy bump, his favorability shot up to 70, 80, almost 90% for the entire year after the storm. And he was running a re-election campaign for the 2013 election season. But his fair weather ratings wouldn't last that long. As he rose to national prominence just before and after Sandy, Christie's downfall began. 3 months after the storm, only 13% of those who submitted claims to FEMA and the Red Cross had received assistance. And more than 50% of New Jersey residents who were hit hardest by the storm were denied services and funds through the New Jersey Stronger campaign, which was also a federally funded Sandy assistance program. This is where Christie starts to spin out, blaming the red tape that was put up following Hurricane Katrina and FEMA assistance. Now, there was some validity to that. Specifically, following Hurricane Katrina, it took about 10 days for disaster declaration to be issued, whereas it took 92 days for emergency aid to be enacted for victims of Hurricane Sandy. It was not until December 28th, 2012 that the Senate approved emergency funding of $60 billion for Hurricane Sandy victims. Even then, the House pushed voting on the bill until after the break and the beginning of the following year. And the final $50.5 billion aid package was not signed by President Obama until January 29th, 2013. And even more than that, New Jersey residents became haunted by a very specific jingle. This ad campaign, Stronger Than the Storm, ran right before the 2013 summer season. The campaign features Christie and his family encouraging people to come back to the Jersey Shore. And just imagine you lost your house, you still don't have any federal aid, and this just keeps playing over the radio. Right. Actual residents of New Jersey didn't feel like they were being seen. Many from the Jersey Shore still didn't have homes or communities to return to. And those most affected by the storm were frustrated with Christie's inability to get them the money that they need. But there's more to the story than just sentiment and perception. There's controversy. In 2013, just weeks before Election Day for the next seat of the New Jersey governorship, it was discovered that Christie was taking federal aid money and funneling it into the marketing campaign to promote Jersey Shore tourism. And I can understand the motive. The industry that employs 10% of the population brings in tens of billions of dollars. It needed to come back. On top of that, there was a separate controversy that Christie was dealing with, known as Bridgegate, which was a purposeful temporary closure of lanes leading into the George Washington Bridge in order to punish a local mayor in New Jersey. His downfall was beginning, but not before he was elected to his second term as governor of New Jersey. I feel like a lot of these meteorology videos stop short at discussing what the lasting impacts of these storms are. A lot has changed in the past 12 years since Hurricane Sandy. Sandy didn't just have natural consequences, but impacted the 2012 general election, propelled Christie to a second term, and even amid controversy, turned federal aid into a political weapon. And I think the what did we learn from this starts here. From a meteorological and forecasting perspective, the name Sandy was retired ahead of the 2013 Atlantic season. As you recall, one of the key problems with communicating the severity of Hurricane Sandy was its post-tropical transition just before landfall. In response to this, the National Hurricane Center stated that they would now be issuing watches and warnings for storms that become post-tropical, beginning with the 2013 Atlantic hurricane season. Another key criticism of the National Hurricane Center was not employing higher resolution forecasting models in a way that the European counterparts did. This criticism ultimately led to a software and hardware update to the overall computer systems used by the National Weather Service. The final meteorological development was that in 2017, the National Hurricane Center started issuing storm surge watches and warnings, and started providing a more localized view of inundation of coastal waters during storms. From a cultural view, the Jersey Shore is back. It's been rebuilt, with visitors spending $49.1 billion in 2023 and an increase of jobs to 500,000 since Sandy. And as for what happened to our main character of the story, Chris Christie, well, once a rising star in the Republican Party, it turns out first that the claims about Bridgegate were actually founded. The Christie campaign did indeed close lanes leading into the George Washington Bridge to punish a local mayor. And on top of that, recovery from Sandy had stalled, including controversies about money being funneled into the Stronger Than the Storm campaign and withholding money from politicians in the New Jersey area who wouldn't endorse his re-election campaign. In 2016, only about 40% of New Jersey residents believed that Christie did a good job with the Hurricane Sandy recovery. So where does this leave us? Coastal communities will always be ephemeral, and there will always be another storm. And if you want to learn more about Hurricane Sandy from a cultural view, I highly recommend this book, Taking Chances: The Coast After Hurricane Sandy, which was a great resource in creating this video. Thanks for watching, and leave your experiences with Hurricane Sandy in the comments below. I'd love to read them.